In a strip of land you could cross in hours, the planet compresses its extremes like a clenched fist. Here, the shoreline of the Dead Sea sits at the lowest land-based elevation on Earth, and it keeps dropping roughly a meter each year, leaving behind sinkholes where yesterday's ground simply vanishes. Above that sinking basin, a major transform fault quietly marks the boundary of moving plates, as if the Earth itself refuses to be still. And then almost abruptly, wetlands appear, and an aerial highway opens. An estimated hundreds of millions of migratory birds funnel through the Great Rift Valley each year. How can one small corridor hold desert salt springs and sky rivers of wings? And what does a landscape become when geology, water, and human memory all fight to write the same map? To understand Israel and Palestine as a place, not just a headline, start with the fact that the land itself is a corridor of sudden drops and abrupt shifts. Within a relatively small distance, the terrain can move from Mediterranean hills and winter rain to bare desert slopes, then plunge into a rift so deep it feels like the planet has been split and held open. At the center of this story is the Jordan Rift Valley, an elongated basin that runs through modern-day Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, part of a much larger geological trench system that stretches beyond what most travelers ever picture. This valley is not just a scenic depression. It is a scar written by plate motion, the Dead Sea, transform a major fault system that forms the boundary between the African plate to the west and the Arabian plate to the east. For roughly 1,000 kilometers, this transform zone has helped shape the region's most dramatic features, creating a chain of pull-apart basins and depressions. The names of those basins read like a travel itinerary, but they are also the chapters of a single geologic narrative: the Gulf of Aqaba, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and the Hula Basin. And then comes the place that steals the breath of anyone standing above it for the first time, the Dead Sea. Its shoreline sits at the lowest land-based elevation on Earth, and recent measurements place its surface around 439.78 meters below sea level. But the Dead Sea is not an ocean. It is an endorheic landlocked lake, a basin with inflow, but no natural outflow where water can only leave by evaporation. That simple fact turns sunlight into a sculptor. Heat drives evaporation salts remain, and the shoreline becomes a changing mosaic, crusted mineral shelves, pale terraces like dried lace, and water that shifts color from steel blue to greenish glass, depending on depth and season. Yet the most haunting detail is this: the Dead Sea is shrinking. Multiple reports describe the level dropping by around 1 meter each year, a retreat that doesn't just redraw the map, it destabilizes the ground. As the waterline falls, fresh groundwater can move into areas once saturated with salt. Underground, that fresh water dissolves salt layers, hollowing the subsurface like sugar melting in tea. The result is sudden collapse sinkholes that can appear without warning, threatening roads and infrastructure along the shore. This is geology behaving like suspense, a landscape where yesterday's safe path can become today's crater. The climate amplifies every contrast. West of the rift, the land rises into limestone hills and ridges. To the east and south, the desert asserts itself. The Judean desert slopes down toward the Dead Sea with sun-bleached rock and dry wadis that only briefly roar to life when rare storms arrive. In the Negev, aridity becomes a way of life, not a season winds that scrape the earth skies that feel too big, and nights that can turn cold enough to make the silence feel physical. And still, this corridor is not uniformly harsh. That is one of its great tricks. Along the rift and its edges, life finds seams, springs, wetlands, and fertile patches where water collects or emerges from hidden channels. The same geological architecture that creates deserts and salt basins also sets the stage for oases and green pockets, small interruptions of color that feel almost impossible when surrounded by stone. This is why the land carries a cinematic tension even before a single human story enters the frame. Here, nature does not transition gradually. It switches from highland to drop-off, from mild coast to desert glare, from wetland reeds to mineral flats. The region's geography behaves like a compressed montage, as if the planet decided to stack multiple worlds into one narrow strip of Earth. And when a place is built on a moving boundary, when faults cut long corridors through rock, when lakes shrink and ground collapses, stability becomes a question, not an assumption. So the next time the map shows a small territory, the deeper question is this: how does a landscape this dynamic shape every form of life that tries to settle on it, plants, animals, and people alike? If the geology is the region's spine, then ecology is its pulse, fast seasonal, and sometimes astonishingly loud. Israel and Palestine sit on a biological crossroads where Europe, Asia, and Africa exchange life through a narrow corridor. And twice a year, that exchange becomes visible in the sky. Along the Great Rift Valley, the Hula Valley, and the Jordan Valley act like a natural funnel. Wetlands and open water offer the one thing every migrating creature needs: a place to land, drink, feed, and recover. One nomination statement for the Hula wetlands describes an immense migration flow, at least 500 million birds of over 200 species passing through the Jordan Valley corridor in autumn and spring. It's not just a pretty spectacle, it's an ecological necessity. Raptors glide on thermals, storks move in broad daylight like living sails, and songbirds travel in invisible waves that only become obvious when they drop into reeds and trees all at once. Even for viewers who don't know a single species name, the message lands. This landscape is part of a continental life support system. Yet the film's most compelling ecological detail is how quickly the ground shifts from abundance to austerity. A few hours' drive can feel like moving between planets. In the north and along the Mediterranean-facing highlands, winter rains can support greener mosaics, scrub woodland pockets, and cultivated terraces. Then the land begins to thin, the trees retreat, and the hills break into pale stone slopes. Southward and eastward, aridity tightens its grip until the Negev and the Judean desert begin to dominate the frame. Desert ecology here is not a story of emptiness. It is a story of precision species designed for heat thirst and long gaps between good years. On cliff faces and rocky ridges, Nubian ibex can appear like silhouettes cut from the mountain itself, gripping ledges that look impossible to stand on. In the same harsh terrain, smaller animals become the quiet engines of survival. Foxes and jackals moving at dawn, hyraxes basking on warm rock, and insects that wait out daylight in cracks and shade. The desert's rule is simple: move when the temperature allows, hide when it doesn't, and never waste moisture. And then, almost as if someone edited in a different biome, the desert opens into green. The oases along the Dead Sea's western edge are where the region's biodiversity becomes emotionally legible because they look like miracles. Ein Gedi, for example, is an oasis and nature reserve where perennial springs feed streams that cut through the Judean desert, creating waterfalls, pools, and dense vegetation within sight of salt flats. It's one of those places where the camera doesn't need to exaggerate. Green reeds and trees stand against sun-bleached rock. Birdsong competes with the sound of falling water. Footprints appear in soft mud where you would expect only dust. Ein Gedi is also a natural stage for the animals that anchor the desert food web. The reserve is known for mammals like Nubian ibex and rock hyrax, and it hosts a blend of plant life that reflects its position between desert and more temperate zones. But even here, modern change is not a distant concept. As the Dead Sea's level declines, sinkholes have appeared in the broader area linked to processes where fresh water interacts with underground salt layers, dissolving them and leaving cavities that can collapse. Ecology, in other words, is tied to geology not just in the deep past, but right now, affecting access safety and the stability of habitats near the shore. This pattern repeats across the region. Life gathers where water gathers. In wadis that briefly flood, seed banks wait for a single storm to trigger a burst of green. In springs that flow year-round, microhabitats form cooler pockets where plants can hold on through summer heat. And where wetlands persist, they become crucial service stations for migration, supporting not just birds, but insects, amphibians, and the plant communities that stabilize soil and provide cover. Then comes the next ecological twist, the sea that isn't the Dead Sea. At the far south, where the land meets the northern Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba Gulf of Eilat holds coral reefs that feel like a different universe from the salt basin only a few hours away. Underwater color returns with force coral structures, schools of fish, and the kind of layered complexity that desert landscapes hide in miniature. And in recent years, scientists and journalists have paid special attention to these reefs because the northern Red Sea has been discussed as a potential thermal refuge, with some coral communities showing unusual resilience compared with many reefs worldwide, even as marine heat waves intensify. This is where the documentary can quietly widen its scope. The same story is being told in two different languages. One on land, one underwater. On land, warming and water scarcity shape what can survive. Underwater, rising temperatures test coral algae partnerships, bleaching thresholds, and the ability of entire ecosystems to recover between heat waves. Even when a reef shows strength, it is not invincible. It is simply fighting with better odds than most. So biodiversity here is not just a list of species. It's a system of corridors and bottlenecks. Sky corridors, where migratory birds rely on wetlands like the Hula as critical stopovers. Stone corridors, where desert-adapted mammals move between cliffs, wadis, and protected pockets to find forage and water. Water corridors, where springs, aquifers, and coastal ecosystems decide where green can exist at all, and where sudden ecological abundance can appear in the middle of an otherwise harsh map. And because the land is so compressed, the consequences of disruption can arrive quickly. Drain a wetland, and a migration route loses a resting place. Overuse groundwater, and springs weaken. Warm the sea, and reef communities face a different kind of drought, one measured in degrees rather than millimeters of rain. Yet the region's ecological story is also one of persistence. Life keeps returning to the same corridors because the geography keeps offering the same narrow chances: a valley that funnels wings a spring, that holds green a reef that catches light at the edge of desert. Which raises the next question the film can't avoid: if nature here depends so heavily on corridors of water, of land, of sky, what happens when human history turns the same corridors into barriers? Long before borders were drawn on paper, this corridor was already a threshold, an in-between space where continents nearly touch and climates change faster than memory. The southern Levant is often described by researchers as one of the key routes for human dispersals out of Africa, a place where different human groups arrived, met, and sometimes vanished, leaving only bone ash and stone as a record. One of the most powerful ways to feel that deep time is to step into the caves of Mount Carmel, where the earth holds an unusually long sequence of human occupation. UNESCO lists the Nahal Me'arot, Wadi El Mughara, cave sites, Tabun, Jamal El Wad, and School as globally significant for understanding human evolution. In a single stretch of limestone, the story spans hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthal remains early anatomically modern humans and later Homo sapiens communities layered through sediments like pages pressed together. In Tabun Cave, evidence of long Paleolithic occupation reaches back hundreds of thousands of years. The deposits themselves are the message-thick accumulated layers of sand and silt that mark repeated returns to the same shelter, different tool traditions, different climates, the same impulse to seek refuge along a coast-to-highland edge. Nearby Skull Cave is associated with early anatomically modern human burials. Fossils often discussed in the broader debate about when modern humans first expanded beyond Africa. UNESCO's documentation highlights School as part of a cluster of sites where early modern human remains are dated to roughly 120,000 $80,000 years, before present an ancient window, when the Levant may have been a green corridor rather than the sharper, drier contrast many see today. And then there is Kafse Cave, another landmark in this deep human map. The Smithsonian's Human Origins program describes Kafse as evidence for very early modern human burials, remains found alongside pieces of red ochre, hinting at symbolic behavior and the possibility that even then humans were doing more than surviving. They were making meaning. What is striking about these places is not only their age, but their implication. This land was not a single origin story. It was a meeting ground. Modern human fossils in the Levant have been discussed in scientific literature as dating to around 130,000 years ago at School and around 190,000 years ago at Kafse. Evidence often used to argue that the corridor saw repeated waves of movement, not one clean exit from Africa. In other words, the Levant was not just a bridge, it was a filter, a gate, a place where climate competition and chance decided which population stayed, which moved on, and which disappeared into prehistory. And the story keeps unfolding. News reporting in 2025 described excavations at Tin Shemet Cave near Shoham, where archaeologists found Middle Paleolithic burials dated to around 100,000 years, with objects like ochre fragments and stones placed alongside the dead, finds presented as strengthening the case that intentional burial and ritual behavior were emerging in this region during that period. The details matter for a documentary because they change the emotional tone of prehistory. These are not anonymous bones. These are bodies carefully arranged in pits with pigments and objects that may have carried significance, early hints of grief identity and belonging. But prehistory here is not only caves and burials. It is also the slow, transformative moment when humans stopped moving with the seasons and began to anchor themselves first to springs, then to fields, then to walls. That pivot is often associated with cultures like the Natufians, typically described as late Epipaleolithic communities in the Levant. who lived roughly $12,000 500 BCE, often discussed for their increasing sedentism and the transition toward plant cultivation that would later define the Neolithic. The Natufian world is important because it reframes what home means. Instead of a temporary camp home, becomes a place revisited. So often, it begins to accumulate architecture, storage, and ritual. Then in the Jordan Valley, that idea of permanence becomes visible in stone. Ancient Jericho, Tel es Sultan, now recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, contains prehistoric deposits tied to the shift towards sedentary communal life and new subsistence economies. UNESCO notes monumental features in the Neolithic layers, most famously a wall, a ditch, and a tower, evidence that by the 9th to 8th millennium BCE, this was already a sizable permanent settlement. The tower itself, massive, deliberate, feels like a declaration humans were no longer just passing through the landscape. They were trying to hold it. From a filmmaking perspective, this is where the region's human origin story becomes visually rich. The camera can move from shadowed cave walls to the blinding openness of the valley, from flint blades to plastered floors, from a spring to the first hints of engineered defense. The land's harshness and generosity are both present fertility clustering around water vulnerability everywhere else. And water is the thread that links everything. Springs shape settlement patterns. Rivers create corridors. Rainfall defines what can be stored. Drought forces invention. Even in the documentary's modern sections, water will return as a central character. Here, in the early chapters, it is already destiny quietly deciding which places could become sacred, permanent, and contested simply because they could sustain life. Agriculture deepens that relationship. In the wider Fertile Crescent context, sources describe the Levant as part of the region where early farming cultures developed, often referenced with the founder crops narrative and the emergence of pre-pottery Neolithic communities. But for viewers, the most tangible image is not a list of crops. It is the way farming reshapes hillsides, how soil is held, water is guided, and stone becomes infrastructure. That is where terraces enter the story. Across the Levant, terraced agriculture is both practical and symbolic walls, stacked by hand to catch thin soil on slopes. Paths worn by decades of feet. Olive groves that look eternal because they are renewed generation after generation. Modern scholarship discussing the southern Levant emphasizes the deep history of olive cultivation in the region and the significance of ancient cultivars and wild populations, an agricultural continuity that becomes even more resonant under present-day environmental stress. In documentary language, terraces are time-made visible geometry against erosion, patience against drought community, against the tendency of the land to slide away. And here, the human story begins to sound less like ancient history and more like a living argument about belonging. Because once people plant trees that take years to mature, the land stops being a backdrop. It becomes inheritance. It becomes identity. It becomes memory that can be walked. The region's earliest cultural foundations, then, are not only about kings and temples. Those chapters come later. The foundation is deeper. The Levant as a corridor where early humans moved, met, and learned. Caves where the dead may have been honored with care. Valleys where springs enabled permanence. And the first large experiments in living together, storing food, and building structures meant to last. So, when later history turns this land into a palimpsest of civilizations and faiths, the documentary can remind the viewer the underlying pattern began long before recorded time. Humans here have always been negotiating with scarcity terrain and the need to belong. Which raises the question that will carry the film into the next chapter. Once permanent settlements exist, once trade routes form, and empires notice a corridor like this, who arrives next? And what do they build on top of everything that was already here? In a land where geography changes in a single day's drive, history tends to do the same switching tones, switching languages, switching rulers, leaving layers rather than a straight line. Israel and Palestine sit on a narrow hinge between continents, and for millennia, that hinge has behaved like a magnet for movement. Caravans, pilgrims, armies, merchants, scholars, and refugees. The landscape didn't just witness history, it channeled it. The earliest exploration routes here were not romantic trails. They were arteries of survival and trade. Along the Mediterranean side ran a corridor later known as the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, an ancient route linking Egypt northward towards Syria and Mesopotamia, following coastal plains before cutting inland through passes and valleys. To the east ran another spine, the King's Highway, a route that connected regions from the Sinai and Aqaba north through Transjordan toward Damascus and beyond, vital for commerce and later pilgrimage traffic. Two routes, two long shadows, one hugging the sea, one riding the highlands and plateaus. Between them lay a land that could never be truly remote, because it was always on the way to somewhere else. That constant passage shaped towns into thresholds. Ports became doorways. Hill cities became checkpoints. Valleys became funnels. The documentary can let viewers feel this by moving the camera like a traveler from era to era, keeping the landscape constant while the human scene changes. Start on the coast. A port like Jaffa is not just photogenic stone and waves. it is the idea of arrival. For centuries, the shoreline was where goods and people entered the Levant, where foreign became local and local became export. Then the film can pivot to a very different urban language, Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, and later expanded dramatically, where the city's modern identity is etched into architecture as clean as a blueprint. UNESCO describes the White City of Tel Aviv as an ensemble of modern movement buildings constructed mainly from the early 1930s to the 1950s, influenced by planners like Patrick Geddes and shaped by architects trained in Europe. It's a powerful contrast for viewers, the ancient port nearby. And just beyond it, a city that reads like the 20th century, made visible white facades, rounded balconies, a design language built for heat and sea breezes. But the strongest historical montage is inland, where stone holds memory with almost stubborn density. Jerusalem is where the documentary must slow down, not because the city is old, but because it carries multiple clocks at once. The Old City of Jerusalem and its walls is inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List 1981 and has been on the list of World Heritage in danger. Since 1982, an official reminder that heritage here is not a static museum display, but a fragile living reality. In cinematic terms, this is where the film becomes intimate narrow lanes, worn steps, stone, polished by centuries of hands. It's also where language must remain careful and documentary neutral, describing what is visible and verifiable while acknowledging that different communities attach different meanings to the same stones. Just south of Jerusalem, the story branches into another layer of pilgrimage and continuity, Bethlehem. UNESCO's listing for the Church of the Nativity and the pilgrimage route notes the site's long identification in Christian tradition and describes the church's development across centuries, including surviving mosaics and surrounding religious buildings and root elements. This is not merely a religious footnote. It is evidence of how movement pilgrims coming and going can shape urban space economy and identity over generations. What happens to a town when it becomes a waypoint on a spiritual map? And what remains when politics, security, and modern pressure complicate that movement? Then there is Hebron, Al-Khalil, another city whose history is carved into an older urban fabric. UNESCO describes the old town of Hebron, Al-Khalil, as a well-preserved ensemble shaped significantly in the Mamluk period, organized around the Ibrahimi Mosque, tomb of the patriarch's compound, highlighting its long-standing role as a pilgrimage destination for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For travel documentary storytelling, Hebron becomes a lesson in how architecture and devotion can knit a city together, and how contested narratives can turn that same city into a symbol far larger than its streets. But history here isn't only about sacred centers. It is also about edges, deserts, and roots that feel empty until the camera shows what they once carried. Head south into the Negev, and the tone changes fewer voices, More sky, more distance. Yet this empty terrain once hosted an international economy of scent and ritual. UNESCO's incense route, desert cities in the Negev, frames the route as part of a vast network that transported frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean over long distances. And it highlights desert towns and landscapes that flourished in antiquity along those trade arteries. This is where the documentary can show ruins not as dead places, but as evidence of adaptation towns built to catch caravans, fortresses to guard routes, and agricultural systems engineered to survive low rainfall. The desert becomes proof that harsh does not mean unused. It means invented for. Then the camera can swing back to the Dead Sea's western escarpment, where another kind of edge history rises from the rock Masada, a fortress plateau overlooking the Dead Sea, described by UNESCO as a rugged natural fortress, with the remains of palaces and fortifications associated with the era of Herod the Great and later events during the Roman period. Even without dramatizing, Masada is cinematic: the climb, the desert wind, the cliff drop into light and haze. It shows how geography becomes strategy, how a plateau can be turned into a statement of security power or last refuge depending on which era is speaking. From there, the documentary can widen again to a timeline that helps viewers understand why so many layers exist at once. Over centuries, the region passed through major imperial and administrative phases, each leaving infrastructure, legal systems, architecture, and demographic changes. A key long arc includes Ottoman rule over much of the Levant, beginning in the early 16th century, with Jerusalem remaining under Ottoman administration until British forces took the city in December 1917. Soon after, the area became part of the British Mandate for Palestine, an administrative framework that lasted from 1920 to 1948. For a travel documentary, this is where street names, building styles, rail lines, and administrative buildings begin to look familiar to modern eyes. Because the 20th century is still close enough to leave a sharp imprint. And then comes the moment when the documentary's historical narrative must be precise and restrained because it touches living memory and ongoing trauma, the end of the British Mandate era, and the international proposals and conflicts that followed. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181-2, recommending a plan to partition mandatory Palestine into independent Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem proposed under a special international regime. This is the sort of fact that can be stated cleanly, date, resolution, intent, without collapsing the documentary into argument. Because what followed is not a simple documentary beat. It is a branching tree of lived experiences, displacement war, and competing national narratives that still shape daily life across the land today. Here, the film can shift from what happened to what it did to movement. Routes that once served caravans and pilgrims also became corridors of control. Villages and neighborhoods that once felt contiguous became separated by new lines, some physical, some legal, some psychological. In a place where ecology depends on corridors, human history began to fracture them. That is why, for viewers, The most powerful historical storytelling may not be the grand timeline alone. It is the way the timeline appears in ordinary geography. In the coastline's split identity, ancient port stones near modern boulevards and towers. In the highlands, where olive terraces and old roads still trace older patterns of labor and land use, even as modern pressures intensify. In the old city's narrow space carrying global meaning and global scrutiny. In the desert ruins that remind the viewer trade once made this region feel connected rather than divided. A strong documentary doesn't need to solve the history. It needs to make the viewer feel the density of it, how the past is not behind glass, but underfoot. So the chapter ends with questions that naturally lead into the modern section. If this land has always been a corridor, what does it mean when corridors become barriers? When access to water farmland, worship education, or work can change with policy conflict or checkpoints? How does culture survive without shrinking? And in a region where the Dead Sea is receding and wetlands are ecologically precious, can the future be narrated in a language other than loss? In the present day, Israel and Palestine can feel like a land where every essential thing is also a negotiation, especially water access and the right to move through the same corridors that nature still relies on. Start with the most elemental pressure fresh water. This is a region of sharp climatic gradients, where long dry seasons and rise in heat make every aquifer spring and pipeline matter. And the modern era has produced two parallel realities that exist shockingly close to each other on one side, advanced systems designed to stretch every drop. On the other, communities living through a collapse of safe supply. Israel is often cited as a global case study in water management, large-scale seawater desalination, extensive reuse of treated wastewater, and national conveyance systems that redistribute water across the country. A World Bank report notes that 5 mega seawater reverse osmosis plants have supplied a very large share of domestic urban water, alongside other system-wide innovations. In cinematic terms, this looks like infrastructure. Most travelers never film intake pipes. Pressure, vessels, control, rooms, reservoirs. Modern engineering, built to withstand a climate that doesn't forgive waste. But in Gaza, the water story is often told in the language of emergency. Humanitarian reporting has long described the coastal aquifer as heavily polluted and overdrawn, with large proportions of groundwater considered unsafe for drinking. And during the war, the crisis deepened into something more severe, a breakdown of the systems that normally keep people alive. Wells pipelines, treatment plants, power supply. A Reuters report in 2025 described major damage to water infrastructure and a drastic reduction in available clean water, with residents sometimes receiving only a few liters per person per day, far below commonly referenced emergency minimums. This is where the documentary must become human without becoming partisan. The camera doesn't need propaganda, it needs proximity. A queue for water, a jerry can carried across broken streets, a tap that runs briefly, then stops. The kind of daily choreography that turns survival into routine. Then the story pulls back to a wider truth. Water is not only a resource here, it's a boundary. When access is uneven or infrastructure is damaged, water becomes a form of timekeeping. How many hours are lost to searching? How many illnesses follow when sanitation fails? How quickly does a city's rhythm change when something as basic as clean water becomes uncertain? And water is only one of the region's modern pressures. Another is the land itself, still shifting under the weight of geology and climate. The Dead Sea. The haunting centerpiece introduced at the beginning is often described as an ecological and economic warning sign. Reporting in 2025 described the shoreline's retreat and the danger of sinkholes linking their formation to freshwater dissolving underground salt layers as the lake level declines. This is not a slow-motion tragedy that stays politely in the background. It shuts down beaches, disrupts agriculture and tourism access, and forces authorities to reroute roads. It also becomes a metaphor the viewer can feel a place famous for floating effortlessly, now marked by ground that can suddenly collapse. And yet, even in the middle of these pressures, the region's living culture keeps moving often in small, resilient ways that don't make international headlines. City life still gathers around food and market stalls. Families still mark holidays and seasons. Music and prayer still share the same air in neighborhoods where history never feels finished. The documentary's tone here should be observational, describing what is seen and heard, not prescribing what it should mean. That same careful lens applies to heritage. The stones are not neutral to everyone, but they are undeniably vulnerable. UNESCO lists the Old City of Jerusalem and its walls as World Heritage, and it has remained on the list of World Heritage in Danger since 1982. In a travel documentary, this becomes a quiet confrontation. How does a place remain living heritage worshipped, inhabited, visited, while also being exposed to political tension, physical wear, and the pressures of mass tourism? Modern culture here is also shaped by how people choose to meet the landscape now, through tourism, conservation, and the search for normal life in abnormal conditions. In the north, for example, ecotourism and conservation are often stitched into the spectacle of migration. The Hula wetlands and the Jordan Valley flyway are described as a major passageway where hundreds of millions of birds move between continents in spring and autumn, an event that can turn bird watching into a kind of seasonal pilgrimage. When wetlands are protected and managed well, they become a form of peacekeeping for nature, a place where the rules are written by biology, not politics. But even that is fragile, dependent on water allocations, land use, and long-term planning. Along the coast, the modern story looks different again. Urban growth design and identity expressed in architecture. UNESCO's designation of the White City of Tel Aviv highlights an urban ensemble built in the early to mid-20th century, adapted to local climate and shaped by modern movement principles. This adds another layer to the film's theme, not only ancient cities and sacred roots, but modern experiments in what a new city should look like in a hot, bright coastal landscape. And across Palestinian cities like Bethlehem and Hebron, Al-Khalil, both recognized by UNESCO for their cultural heritage, modern life continues inside historic urban fabric, where stone streets and old courtyards are not just attractions, but daily space. That continuity is the documentary's human anchor, the reminder that culture is not a museum label. It is people opening shops in the morning, children walking to school, artisans repairing doors, neighbors greeting each other in alleyways that have carried footsteps for centuries. So the modern chapter becomes a question of balance. How can water systems be secured and repaired fast enough to protect life? How can environmental damage like the Dead Sea's retreat be addressed when solutions require coordination across a politically fractured region? How can heritage remain living and protected at the same time, especially in places officially recognized as in danger? And maybe the most difficult question of all, when ordinary life has to constantly adapt, what does stability even mean here, and who gets to experience it? Israel and Palestine are often described with words that belong to politics, borders claims, security conflict. But step back far enough, and another language begins to speak. The land itself tells a story that started long before modern headlines, a corridor carved by a transformed fault, shaped by deserts and sudden springs, and defined by water that can vanish, return, or become contested. At the Dead Sea, the planet's lowest shoreline feels like a warning written in salt. A place famous for effortless floating now lives with the quiet instability of retreating water, and sinkholes, proof that even ancient landscapes can change fast when climate and human use push the system too far. In the wetlands and valleys farther north, migratory birds trace an older map, one that ignores borders and follows only wind thermals and the need to survive. Their passage is a reminder that this region is not isolated. It is part of a continental network of life. And in the caves, terraces, old towns, and living streets, the human story is layered the same way. The geology is layered, compressed, overlapping, sometimes contradictory. UNESCO listings for places like the Old City of Jerusalem and its walls, Bethlehem's pilgrimage route, and Hebron's Old Town underline just how globally significant and how fragile this heritage remains. Meanwhile, modern pressures, especially water security and infrastructure, show how quickly daily life can be forced into survival mode when systems fail or are damaged. A travel documentary cannot fix a region's hardest questions, but it can change the way viewers look at them. It can replace distance with detail and reduce the temptation to see people as symbols rather than as humans living inside a landscape that never stops demanding adaptation. So if this film leaves one request behind, let it be a simple one. Look deeper than the headline. Learn the geography before the argument. Respect the heritage as living, not frozen. And when traveling or sharing stories about this land, support voices and projects that protect water ecosystems and cultural memory, because these are the threads that hold any future together. On a map, the edge of the world is just a line. But here the edge is a question that never fully disappears. When the ground shifts, the water shrinks, and history crowds the present. What does it mean to keep choosing life anyway?